everyone. I'm attorney Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Colorado, and you are watching All Up in Your Business. On this episode of All Up in Your Business, we're going to talk about the differences between being self-employed, freelancers, contractors, gig workers, and all of these other terms that are really just different ways of saying not an employee. But first, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. Okay, so we hear a lot of different words and terms that get thrown around in business. Words like freelancer, contractor or independent contractor, gig worker. I see this in the comments a lot on my videos too. People asking things like, how does this apply to freelancers? So of course it brings up the question, what is the difference between all of these things? How do I know if I'm an independent contractor or a freelancer? And the answer is this: there is no difference. Legally speaking, they are all the exact same thing. That's right. Self-employed, freelancer, independent contractor, 1099 worker, contract worker, platform worker, gig worker, side gigs or side hustles. They're all exactly the same thing. And basically, they're all different ways of saying, I'm not an employee. Of course, some terms are used more often depending on the context. We commonly hear things like freelance writers or freelance designer. The term gig workers we often use when we're referring to people who work with companies like Lyft and Uber drivers. We might use side hustle if we're talking about somebody who does work on a platform like Upwork or Fiverr. But in the legal and tax world, they all mean the same thing. If you perform a service for someone else, whether it be another person or a business, you can be one of two things. You're either an employee of that person or you're an independent contractor. Now, of course, that's not always the case 100% of the time. There are some situations where you may be considered something else. But for the most part, generally speaking, you are either an employee or an independent contractor. And if you're an independent contractor, then for all intents and purposes, you are considered self-employed. I am a lawyer and I own my own law practice. So of course, I consider myself to be self-employed. But when I do legal work for my clients, I'm doing so as an independent contractor of my clients because I'm not their employee. But I could also call myself a freelance lawyer or even a gig lawyer if I wanted to. Literally, it just means that I'm not an employee of my clients. The IRS's website gives a definition of the term independent contractor. It says, if you're an independent contractor, you are self-employed. So congratulations to all of you freelancers, gig workers, and side hustlers out there. You may not have realized it, but you are actually self-employed business owners. And being self-employed refers to the lack of an employer-employee relationship. It means that you are responsible for your own work and your own expenses, including taxes. Let's back up a little bit and talk about what an employer-employee relationship is. First off, employees have certain rights that independent contractors typically do not have. For example, employees have a right to not be discriminated against because of their race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, age, or genetic information, and they have a right to report that discrimination without the fear of being punished for doing so. They have the right to equal pay for equal work. They have a right to reasonable accommodations due to medical conditions or religious beliefs. They have a right to confidentiality of certain medical or genetic information that they might share with their employer. Employees must be paid at least minimum wage and are entitled to certain rest and lunch breaks. Sometimes they're entitled to overtime and holiday pay. These rights are inherent in every employer-employee relationship. And that's not the case with independent contractors. If I talk to a potential client and they decide not to hire me because I'm a woman and they prefer to work with a man attorney, that's their prerogative. But if I'm interviewing potential employees, I can't base my hiring decision on the person's gender. If my employee works more than 40 hours in a week, I have to give them overtime pay. But if I work more than 40 hours in a week, which, believe me, is not all that uncommon, I can't go looking for my clients to pay me more because of that. Unless, of course, we have some kind of contractual agreement saying that I'll get paid more if I go over a certain amount of time or whatever the case may be. Employers also take on a lot of responsibilities when it comes to employees. The employer is responsible if an employee is injured while performing their job duties. That's why we as employers have workers' compensation insurance coverage. We have to pay for things like medical expenses if an employee gets injured on the job. There's this fun Latin phrase in the legal world called respondeat superior. It translates into something like, let the superior answer. It means that an employer is legally responsible and liable for the actions of its employees. If my employee is performing their job duties and hurts somebody else, I'm legally responsible and liable for that. Now, of course, it doesn't strictly apply like that all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm always responsible for everything my employee goes through. But generally speaking, employers are responsible and liable for the acts of their employees. And that is not the case with independent contractors or freelancers or gig workers or whatever else. If my social media manager, who is an independent contractor, injures herself or someone else while she's setting up my Instagram content calendar, that's her problem, not mine. Or if I'm trying to multitask and I walk up the stairs while I'm working on a trademark application and I trip and fall and break my leg, that is my problem, not my client's problem. So employers have a lot of responsibilities when it comes to their employees. But with that responsibility also comes a lot of control, which brings me to the next question. How do I know if someone is an employee or an independent contractor? The number one most important thing to remember when it comes to employee versus contractors is this. It is not a choice that you get to make. You do not get to decide if a worker gets classified as an independent contractor or an employee. And this goes both ways. If you are the worker, it is not up to you to decide if you want to be treated as an employee or as a contractor. It is 100% completely dependent on the nature of the working relationship. There's no single rule or test for determining if someone is an employee or an independent contractor. Unfortunately, I wish there was. But there are a lot of different factors that can be taken into consideration depending on the situation and context. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that because there is a lot of detail about that, so I'll save that for another video. But for the most part, it comes down to control and independence. And for the most part, it is the employer or the person doing the hiring who is responsible for making sure a worker is properly classified. The employer will be the one who gets in trouble if they misclassify an employee as an independent contractor. It's not the employee's responsibility. When I started hiring my first employee, an administrative assistant, I had a non-lawyer colleague who asked me, why did you decide to hire them as an employee instead of a contractor? And my answer to that question was because they're an employee, not a contractor. There was no question in my mind that this administrative assistant position would be an employee position. I would be training her on pretty much every aspect of her job. I would be directing her on exactly what I needed her to do and how I wanted it to be done, when it needed to be done. I would be telling her what days and times she needed to work. I'd be giving her a laptop and access to all of the software and programs she would need to do her job. I can't avoid the responsibilities of being an employer simply by calling her an independent contractor. So going back to the whole point of this video in particular, independent contractors, gig workers, freelancers, whatever you want to call it, they're all really different ways of saying self-employed or not an employee. And regardless of the term that you want to attach to it, self-employed means self-employed. You are taxed the same as any other self-employed person, and you're eligible to take the same kinds of business tax deductions that any other self-employed person would. You can form and operate as an LLC or a corporation just the same as any other business owner can, and the process for doing so is the same, regardless of what kind of self-employed you are. It means that you are responsible for yourself. You are responsible for your own actions. You're responsible for your own taxes. You're responsible for deciding how much money you earn and how you go about earning it. Everything that applies to self-employed people applies to you, whether you want to call yourself self-employed, a business owner, a contractor, a freelancer, a gig worker, or just make up some completely new term for yourself. It's all the same. That's all for this episode, folks. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. And again, don't forget to check the description for links to additional information and resources. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time.